two things I wanted to say about that. I mean, first of all, this is really not for everybody. I mean, because it's like pregnancy. Either you are or you're not. I mean, there's no in between.
Not a little pregnant?
You can't be kind of a little pregnant. Either you are or you're not. And so you can't.
Who is it for and who's it not for?
Yeah. What I found is that when I started studying spontaneous remissions, it was for people who had reached the end of their emotional belief, where there was no longer any answers. The doctors gave up on it, had nothing else to do, right? And so they changed everything about themselves. And some of them were physicians, it's just going like, wow, well, what have I been doing? But now, fast forward to today. I mean, in an age of information, ignorance is a choice. I mean, you got so much information. You don't need a doctor, you don't need a teacher, you don't need a priest or a minister to gain information. You don't need an authority, right? Technology gives us the very quick information. So now people are informed. 20 years ago, a doctor said, do you have this health condition?
You believed it.
Yeah, and not only that, you signed on the dotted line and you got the treatment or the surgery. Fast forward to today, everybody just kind of goes, wait a second.
There's multiple opinions,
yeah,
let me get this.
You go home and you research it and you say, I want to try this. So now all of a sudden people are taking their power back. So people are more informed. So surgical procedures, pharmaceuticals are not always the first choice for people because there's other ways. And people only do the best with what's available. So now information has scaled and changed the way people face off with health conditions. And now people are coming into this, number one, if they have a health condition, that they can self-correct. And number two, there are people that are saying, if I'm headed for a genetic destiny, because my mother had this health condition, my father had this, and I know the gene doesn't create it, but how I act and how I feel is going to signal the same gene. Well, I'm going to just change my genetic future. So now people are super proactive in the process, right? So that's point number one. But point number two is that if you start realizing that this is actually possible, and I can tell you that without a doubt it is, because we were talking before we started, the things that I'm witnessing. I mean, if in the beginning it was just like a person got a little better, you felt a little this, a little that, their food allergies went away, but then all of a sudden we're talking about, in our last event, 2 people with stage 4 cancer, completely reversed.
Wow.
A woman with a very serious neurological disorder, they couldn't even name it. Crutches, the whole bit, left the event, no crutches. Well, how did she do that? Well, let me ask you a question. If she doesn't look like a movie star and she's not buffed and young and attractive and successful, she's just like a normal person, and you listen to this person's story and there's 1,000 people listening to that story, you're going to scratch your head and say, wow, if she can do it, so can I. And just like, an infection spreads amongst a community that creates disease, health and wellness can be as infectious as disease.
Right.
So do I use it? Yes, but not in the way that people think. Like, I'm not interested in success. I've had it. I know that that's an important element. I think success is a side effect of who you are. But what am I after? I'm after making a difference in the world. I want people to become empowered. So my rehearsals, my meditations, and connecting are all about the next thing that we can push the envelope for. In other words, if that person healed themselves of that health condition and this person healed themselves, is it possible for that person to heal another person? And if they can heal that other person, which is now happening, is it possible to heal somebody on the other side of the planet? But you just have to build the model and then come up with the science to be able to piece it together. And science, turns out, is the language to help to demystify that process. So I now know without a doubt, if you give people sound scientific information, and every time they learn something new, they're adding new connections in their brain. That's what learning is.
Wow.
And if they can begin to pay attention for just 1 hour, now they're causing jungles of neurons to begin to organize as a platform of understanding. If I say to you, now turn to the person next to you and explain what I said, and we do this in our events. If you can turn to the person next to you and explain what you said, you've wired it in your brain. What's the relevance of that? Now, you're installing the neurological hardware in your brain in preparation for an experience. And if the more you understand what you're doing and why, the how gets easier.
Right.
And if nothing's left to conjecture, superstition or dogma or spiritual new age stuff, but it's grounded in science, you're going to have more intention behind what you're doing, and you're going to assign more meaning to it.
More believable.
Exactly.
Not just blind faith.
No, it's
something's backing it as
right.
well. Yeah.
And then if we can set up the conditions in the environment and give people the proper instruction, And those people that get their behaviors to match their intentions and their actions equal to their thoughts, think of their mind and body working together, they're going to have a new experience. And that experience then is going to enrich even more circuits in their brain. The end product of an experience is an emotion. And all of a sudden, they're going to feel unlimited. They're going to feel empowered. They're going to feel successful. They're going to feel worthy. Now they're teaching their body chemically to understand what their mind is intellectually understood. Knowledge is for the mind, but experience is for the body, and they're embodying that information. Well, they've done it once, should be able to do it again. And while you keep repeating the experience, you know this as an athlete, it's going to become automatic.
Right.
It's going to become innate. It's going to become second nature. It's going to become who you are. You don't have to think about it any longer. So take a person who was abused as a child with an alcoholic parent who has a very rare genetic disorder. They've manifested weakness in their bones because that's the emotion they live by. Genetic disorder that medical science says we have no way to help you. How do you explain after a year of every day going after it, overcoming herself to become someone else, that no more any fractured bones, no evidence of broken bones, no more crutches, no more wheelchair, running again? How do you explain that except she literally became someone else? She became somebody else. The disease existed in the old personality. She's not that person any longer.
Wow.
No, so biologically, that's absolutely possible. So for me, I chase the mystical. I want those profound moments where I cannot go back to being the same guy again. Because once you taste that wine or you drink from that well, all of a sudden, the way you perceive reality changes. Because you start to see things that always existed, but you didn't have the circuitry in place to perceive them. Why? Because the inner event is an experience. An experience enriches the brain. We don't see things how they are. We see things how we are. So as you begin to change your circuitry, you're going to perceive more of reality. And why? Because we probably perceive 1% of reality. So how do we begin to fully engage, right? So for me, none of that matters. None of that veneer stuff matters. What matters is the essence. What matters is, am I making a difference in the world? How can I begin to affect a change and help people to heal or create a better life for themselves, and not do it matter to matter, with bravado and adrenaline and all that. That's the old way. This is about connecting, and instead of going and getting it, creating a field where you draw it to you, and the synchronicities and the coincidences and the opportunities that are coming to you as a result of you doing the inner work, you're going to rush less in your life, and you're going to be more aware of your energy. And nobody changes until they change their energy. And when you change your energy, you change your life. But that doesn't mean you change your energy, do a meditation, and you get up and then get on a freeway and flip people off.
Right.
You just disconnected from the energy of your future. You got to be greater than the conditions in your environment. You got to maintain that state of being. You got to be greater than the habits and emotions of your body. And you got to sustain it for an extended period of time.
Which means you'd have to start thinking about what you've been thinking about and change it. You'd have to become aware of your unconscious habits and behaviors and even what you say and modify them. And then you'd have to look at those emotions that keep you anchored to the past and decide if those emotions belong in your future. So most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. We literally have to become someone else. In other words, thoughts are the language of the brain, and feelings are the language of the body. And how you think and how you feel creates a state of being. So most people have experiences in their life that brand them emotionally. They feel fear, they feel anger, they feel bitterness, they feel frustration, they feel insecurity. And those emotions then become part of their identity. So once they think certain thoughts that turn on certain circuits in their brain that are equal to their insecurity, and then they feel insecure. The moment they feel insecure, they think more insecure thoughts, which makes more chemicals for them to feel insecure. And the repetition of that cycle over time conditions the body to subconsciously become the mind of insecurity. So then the person says, I am insecure. And whenever you say, I am anything, you're commanding your mind and body towards a destiny. So then most people's biology is, for the most part, their past. And so if you're not being defined by the vision of the future, some new possibility in your life, you're only left with the old circuitry in your brain and the old emotions of the past. So the question then is, can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses yet, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain is literally changed to look like the experience has already occurred? Now, the latest research in neuroscience says you can change your brain just by thinking. So then, as you begin to think about a new possibility, and your brain begins to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations, and you begin to plan your behaviors, and you begin to review in your mind, mentally rehearse who you're going to be in your life, the mere action of mental rehearsal begins to install the neurological circuits in your brain. Now your brain is no longer a record of the past. Now it's in fact a map to the future. And if you were then to begin to emotionally embrace your future before it's made manifest, in other words, you're not waiting for your healing to feel wholeness. You're not waiting for your new relationship to feel love. You're not waiting for the mystical moment to feel awe. You're not waiting for your success to feel empowered. That's the old model of reality, of cause and effect. In other words, the materialist, the person who's waiting for their wealth to come to feel abundance, they're living by that model of cause and effect. But the quantum model is about causing an effect, which means you begin to experience your own worthiness and your abundance before it occurs. You have to feel wholeness in order for your healing to occur. We have to feel love for ourselves and love for life in order for us to have love in our life. And so then to instruct people how to teach their body emotionally how that future could feel like before it's made manifest, if they do it properly, their body as the unconscious mind begins to believe it's living in that future reality in the present moment. And they're beginning to signal new genes in new ways that begins to change their body to look like the event has already occurred. So the process of change in the meditative model requires unlearning and relearning. It requires breaking the habit of the old self and reinventing a new self. What we say in neuroscience, pruning synaptic connections and sprouting new connections, unfiring and unwiring and refiring and rewiring, unmemorizing emotions that are stored in the body and then reconditioning the body to a new mind and to a new emotion, no longer signaling the same genes in the same way, but signaling new genes in new ways. Beginning to pull your energy out of the past and beginning to invest your energy into the future. What we're teaching people how to do is not to pray to have their prayers answered, but to get up from their meditations as if their prayers are already answered. Because when they're combining that clear intention of their future with that elevated emotion, they're literally changing their energy, they're changing their brain chemistry, they're changing the way their brain works, they're changing their genetic expression, they're changing their chemistry. They're literally becoming somebody else. And over again, when people do this, it may take them months to turn their disease around. But over and over again, we've seen this. They come back to a certain level of awareness, and the disease is no longer there. And it's almost like the disease existed in the old personality. They're literally someone else. And we've seen it enough times now to know that people reach a certain point with themselves where they feel so whole, they feel so satisfied with who they are, they feel so happy with themselves and their lives that they could care less if they have the disease. And that's the moment it goes away over and over again. In order for some of us to wake up, we need a wake-up call. And in 1986, I got the call. I was in a triathlon in Palm Springs, California, and I was in the biking portion of the race. And I was coming up to this intersection, and there were two cyclists that were turning onto another road. And there was a police officer that was standing on the opposite side, and he was pointing at me, and he was telling me to turn and to merge onto this road. And so I was locked in on him, and I wasn't paying attention to the road. And the problem was he had his back to the oncoming traffic. So as I made the turn, a four-wheel drive Bronco going about 55 miles an hour hit me from behind and catapulted me out of my bicycle. And I landed on my lower back and my buttocks. And when you land very hard, the compressive force basically puts a downward pressure on the vertebrae. And the compressive force compressed 6 vertebrae in my spine. The 8th thoracic vertebrae, the 9th thoracic vertebrae, 10, 11, 12, and the first lumbar vertebrae. And when you compress volume like that, the matter has to go somewhere. And in my case, it went back towards my spinal cord. One of the vertebrae, the 8th thoracic vertebrae, was more than 60% collapsed, and the neural arch, where the spinal cord passed through, had broken like a pretzel. So I had multiple compression fractures of my thoracic spine and upper lumbar spine. I had bone fragments on my spinal cord, and I had compression of the cord because of the neural arch being fractured. And so they took me to the hospital, and I had 4 opinions from 4 leading surgeons in Southern California. And the prognosis was I'd probably never walk again, and that I needed a radical surgery called the Harrington rod surgery. And in Harrington rod surgery, they basically cut off the back parts of your vertebrae. They screw in these long stainless steel rods. And by screwing those rods in there, they cantilever and pull the spinal column off the spinal cord, and it opens up a pathway. And then they take bone fragments from your hip and they paste it over the top, and they hope for the best. So in my case, it would be from the base of my neck to the base of my spine because of the number of vertebrae that were compressed. And so I think that if this had been anybody else, I probably would have recommended that they have the surgery. But this was me. And I wasn't so quick, based on the x-rays and the CAT scans and MRIs, to just decide to have the surgery. And so I think one of the biggest things about making a choice when you're indecisive, it's one of the difficult times because you're weighing what you know against what you don't know. And you reach this point in your life where it's like a dark night of the soul, because when you realize that nobody has the answers to your problems but you, then you start this process of stepping out into the unknown. Now, in 1986, in Southern California, not a lot of people were going against convention, whether it was scientific convention or medical convention or social convention or religious convention. But I think that when you step outside of convention, that's the definition of a miracle. So when you do something like that, you're always considered foolhardy or insane until you pull it off, and then you're a saint or a mystic or a genius. So I decided for myself personally that I was willing to step out into the unknown, that I couldn't imagine myself living on addictive medications for the rest of my life or being in a wheelchair. And so I decided to check out of the hospital. And I just had this one thought, and the thought was, the power that made the body heals the body. And I couldn't stop thinking about that because I knew that there's an intelligence that's giving us life that keeps our heart beating and digesting our food. And that consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention. So it must be observing or paying attention to who I am. So I decided that I was going to make contact with this intelligence. And I was going to give it a plan, a template, a design. I was going to get very specific on what I wanted. And when I was happy with my creation, I was going to surrender this creation to a greater mind because it knows how to heal way better than I do. And the second thing I said was, I'm not going to let any thought slip by my awareness that I don't want to experience. Now, this sounds really easy from an intellectual standpoint, but I learned very quickly that I couldn't get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. And when we're in crisis or trauma, like I was, we tend to focus on what we don't want to have happen instead of what we do want to have happen. So out of the infinite potentials that exist for us as human beings, I was selecting the worst case scenario. over and over again in my mind and embracing that emotionally and being prepared for that event, because if anything less happened, I would have better chances of survival. And I think when we're in crisis, it's those survival chemicals, those hormones of stress that prepare us for the worst case scenario. So I would start off in my mind reconstructing my spine vertebrae per vertebrae, and then I'd start thinking about living in a wheelchair. And then I'd become aware that I was focusing on what I don't want to have happen instead of what I do want to have happen, and I'd stop and realize that I'd have to start all over. And the reason being was because this intelligence is a presence. And just like when you know someone is present with you, they're paying attention to you, and you know when they're not, and they're distracted. So I reasoned that I had to be completely present with it, and it had to get a very clear signal, a very clear plan. So I would start all over again and start reconstructing my spine, and then I'd start thinking about, should I sell my home, should I sell my practice? And I'd stop again, become conscious, and then I'd get frustrated, and then I'd get impatient, and then I'd get angry, and then it would just get worse. And so for 6 weeks, I went through this incredible dark night of the soul because I couldn't really get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. And it would take me about 3 hours closing my eyes and reconstructing every single vertebrae and starting over again every time I lost my attention. And then I was never satisfied really with the way it was, the way I did it, but I would just keep going. At the end of 6 weeks, I went through the whole entire process without losing my attention. And it was like I hit a tennis ball in a sweet spot. Something clicked in that moment. I clicked. And I knew in that moment that something happened. And what was taking me 3 hours to do, I was able to do in 45 minutes. And at the time, I didn't know it, but I was firing and wiring new circuits in my brain every single day. And I was literally improving my ability to pay attention. And attention is a skill, just like golf or tennis. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. So I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't doing anything. I was basically laying face down, and I had a lot of time on my hands, so this was the object of my affection. At that time, when I was able to go through that whole rehearsal, I started noticing significant changes in my body. My pain levels dropped and diminished immediately. Some of the neurological problems I was having were improving. Numbness, tingling, my motor functions started coming back. And the moment I correlated what I was doing inside of me with the effect that I was producing outside of me, I started paying attention to what I was doing and did it with more passion and more enthusiasm instead of dread and frustration. And it was that elevated emotion that I started to realize that was actually the catalyst to make it fun and easy. And then I just started thinking about if I was ever able to walk again, what did I take for granted, like a sunset or a shower or sitting with my friends and enjoying a meal. And all of a sudden I started selecting potentials in the quantum field that were no longer based on the worst case scenario, but really some future possibility. And I began to emotionally embrace and experience it completely, whether it was a sunset on the beach or a shower. I would live it and emotionally feel it. And I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I think when you combine a clear intention with an elevated emotion, you move your body and brain from living in the past to living in the future. And the brain and body actually don't know the difference when you're truly focused and paying attention between what's going on in your outer world and what's going on in your inner world. And the very process of the elevated emotion began to convince my body that I was living in that future reality in the present moment, because the body's the unconscious mind, it doesn't know the difference. That I began to signal new genes in new ways, and my body began to change dramatically. And I was back on my feet in 10 weeks, and back training again at 12 weeks, and I never have any pain in my body or in my back, and I just made a deal with myself, and the deal was with this intelligence that if I was ever able to walk again, I'd spend the rest of my life studying the mind-body connection and mind over matter. And pretty much that's what I've been doing since 1986.
Amazing.
I'm beginning to understand that, and I would never say this even 2 years ago, that we have to be able to execute from energy and from the field. And when we change the field, it's not our job to change matter. That's the side effect, you know. And so I've seen really profound and wonderful healings, and when you interview those people, they'll always say the same thing: it wasn't me. I swear to you, it wasn't me that did this. Some greater power that lives within me and lives within you did it, and I just got out of the way for something greater to happen. So I think we have to lay down the very thing we used our whole life to get what we want for something greater to occur, and that just takes a little practice and developing of a skill.